Okay, thank you very much for joining us today for the AFAC Fire Brigade Intervention Model Manual webinar. My name's Ivan West. I'm the Manager for Community Safety at AFAC. Today we'll be presenting on the latest changes to the AFAC Fire Brigade Intervention Model. I'm sure most of you are already aware of the latest manual being published a few weeks ago. If you're looking for where to download the manual, I will drop the link into the Q&A panel to the side of your screen shortly. In the interest of time, today's webinar will just be focused on the manual and the latest changes and not the computer-based FBIM program. If you're interested in receiving updates, including possible access to the beta program, please register your email using the link that I will also place in the Q&A panel shortly. While preparing for these webinars, we identified possible opportunity to develop a short video series that could help walk the user through the manual as a whole, and not just the updates that this webinar will be endeavouring to do. If you believe this has merit, could you place a thumbs up on the item in the Q&A panel that I'll put there shortly as well? Thanks. So without taking up any more of your time, I'd like to introduce both John Clampett and Jamie Business. John, as a member of the original FBIM working group in the 90s, will provide a short background and the intent of the manual. Then Jamie will go through the changes in some detail. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A panel. Depending on time, we will endeavour to answer them all. So I'd like to welcome John Clampett. John.
All right, welcome everyone. John was going to go through and just give a bit of a background to FBIM and what its purpose is, and like I said, some of the history of its early development and where we've got to now. So hopefully we'll come back to that, just to give you a bit more perspective of where the model sits and how it's intended to be used. So the focus of my presentation is just to go through some of the main changes to the document from the previous version. The latest one was back in 2004, and there was a 97 version prior to that. John will go through. So I've got a few main sections for today's presentation. So I'll go through the format, some editorial changes, then have a look at the contents of the manual and just a very brief overview of the model. So again, today is not intended to be a training program or package. It's purely just focusing on what changes are made, but just for some people who may not be very familiar with the program, we'll go through just a very brief overview. We'll look at the margins for safety. That's one of the changes, significant changes that's been made. Then we'll briefly look at some of the revisions and updates to the various charts. All right, so changes to format. So it's been converted to the current AFAC guideline document template. The data sets, that is the tables and the graphs, have been moved to a separate document. So they were the previous section 7 items. And you can see a link to that in the box below. So there's 2 separate publications now. The intent behind that is so that we can more easily update the data and numbers as we get further data in, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. The FBIM application example that was previously section 8 has not been included. However, as Ivan's noted, we're looking at potentially providing some more example type documents, as well as potentially doing some further online information around how you actually apply the model. All right, so firstly, there's been editorial changes. So there's been some general updates to the text. So some of the areas such as the scope, background, introduction, etc., have added some text to provide some further clarification. Any grammar, spelling, editorial, minor editorial errors have been fixed up as they've been picked up. We've updated the terminology. So things like the performance-based design brief has been included to tie that in with the FEB and FSEB, as it has been over the last number of years since FBIM was first developed. References to the latest IFEG, so the latest fire safety system references, SS methods and the like, as the previous versions of the manual had the old fire engineering guideline 1996 version references. Some outdated text that was no longer considered necessary has been removed. So for section 3, there was international practices in modelling fire brigade intervention is one example, and a few other parts of sections have been removed as well, as they were no longer considered necessary. And hopefully it just tidies the document up a bit more for our current day. So looking at the contents of the manual, so the current manual has 5 main sections. So it starts off with an about AFAC and AFAC doctrine, just to set the scene about what AFAC doctrine looks like. Then there's an about this document section that sets out the purpose, audience and scope of the manual. Section 1 gives us an introduction. Section 2 has structural firefighting operations. So that provides an overview of fire brigades, firefighting, tactics, methods, etc. Again, very high level overview. Section 3 discusses the relationship between FBIM and fire engineering analysis, how it's meant to be incorporated and interrelates. Section 4 gives an overview of the model, so it describes some of the factors that contribute to each of the aspects of FBIM. And then section 5 is our main section, which is actually the fire brigade intervention model. It has various charts of activities. It walks through the methodology, how you develop critical paths, and the like. And then there's some references provided in the supporting discussion. All right, so just again, for a very brief overview of the model, it consists of a number of charts detailing fire brigade intervention activities. And as we'll see, that's from sort of the start of fire notification type time of the fire brigade, all the way through to the end to deal with things like extinguishment, search and rescue, exposure protection, and salvage type operations. It's a dynamic process that has both internal and external influences. What we mean by that is it's dynamic in terms of you may have an external influence, such as your design fire and whatever systems are activating in the building prior to fire brigade arrival. They will then impact on the fire brigade attending. Once the fire brigade attends, there will be certain actions undertaken that then may have an impact on that design fire. And so you then have to sort of iterate in and out between these internal and external influences. And the process changes depending on what paths are chosen within the model. And that, as per the last dot point, involves interactions with the fire engineering analysis. So your design fire development, your smoke modelling, your evacuation modelling, and then the interactions with the various fire safety subsystems. So this is a figure 5.1 from the manual, which kind of shows this interrelationship. So you have your fire engineering analysis and your fire safety subsystems, all part of the performance-based design brief. That has an input into sort of charts 1 to 4, which is notification of the fire brigade through to arrival. And then following charts are undertaking, assessing the actions undertaken by fire brigade once on scene, and they all have an impact on the fire ground status. Again, we've got table 5.1 from the manual. It shows a list of internally generated and externally generated critical strategy determination points. So internally, there are a number of decisions that need to be made within the flow charts, and we'll have a bit of a look at what they look like later. And at the conclusion of each flow chart, it's helpful to consider what is the status on the fire ground. So what is the stage of fire development? What are the conditions like in the building? And just to sort of take a snapshot of what that's like. Externally generated key kind of determination points are things like time of flashover, when tenability limits for occupants and firefighters are reached within various enclosures, when smoke spreads to adjoining compartments, when radiant heat flux to adjoining property exceeds the thresholds, times of evacuation being completed, what the fire size is at various times, but particularly the time of attack, and then any potential structural collapses. This is an example again from the manual, just showing how you might lay out these various critical times, just to consider. If we look at, say, the first one, brigade arrival at the curbside, we look at what's going on in the room of origin, what's going on in the adjacent enclosure, what are the occupants doing. So based on that situation, what are the resources that are necessary, and then considering what actually is available in terms of what you've correspondingly used in previous flow charts. So, you know, your first pass, there might be 2 appliances that are dispatched. If you go down onto, you know, further ones, so if we look at the last one, untenable conditions, we're saying there that we need 2 pumpers that are as a necessary resource, but there's only been 1 that's available previously called up. So again, this is just a chart, a table, just to help relay some of the information to help make decisions throughout the process. So a key to the charts, again, this is all from the manual, so you can go back and have a look there, but essentially the flow charts are made up of a number of these elements. Just going to turn my pointer on. All right, so we've got a beginning and an end of workflow represented by this sort of shaped box with a white background. Decision boxes are shown by a diamond, a white diamond, and so that indicates that a decision needs to be made. So, you know, can we proceed without additional resources? Yes, no. Is a sprinkler system installed? Yes, no. The darker grey, or the grey shaded box with white text without any letter, means that a time or calculation is required. Usually that requires either some input from the fire engineer, so it could be a detection time. It could also be an FEB type discussion point. The same coloured box with a letter in the top right hand corner indicates that there is actually a table or data in the subsequent FBIM supplementary document to give you some guidance as to what's required there. So that's based on a number of drills. So it could be the time to lay out a hose, it could be the time to put on gear, those sorts of things where we actually have data that needs to be used. If there's a subsequent chart that's referred to within a chart, we've got this darker grey box, the white lines, and then the red box indicates that there's a possible loss of life or property, and generally that's occurring where the path is going down to a point where we're unable to continue with fire brigade intervention successfully, and therefore we're ending the model, and obviously we need to go back and reconsider the design. All right, so that's the kind of typical layout of what the charts look like, similar to the previous version. However, as we go through, we'll see that we've made a few amendments. So like I said, the major change is the discussion about margins for safety. So section 4.31 of the previous FBIM manuals had a major revision. This came about because there was uncertainty expressed as to how we implement some of these items. So there was a multiplying factor or factor of safety. There was also the percentiles. So there's questions about, do you do a multiplying factor on top of the percentiles? Is that done right at the end for each element? So there was some uncertainty expressed there. And also, I guess, reported applications resulting in very conservative results. So we've retitled the section to calculation method and simplified the approach. We've removed the multiplying factor section. And so essentially now you have either the set times that are given as data and you use those times. And then the areas that have percentiles, there's some further guidance about how we actually develop up a reasonable assumption for those sum of percentile times. So if we're considering just an individual action, the procedure for obtaining the desired percentile is still using the Chebyshev's rule that was in there before, which is essentially depending on your percentile that you're after, we use a multiplying factor by this number of standard deviations. So for an individual item, that hasn't changed. And so as we've alluded to, the data for the FBIM activities that's given in the tables is given in terms of means and standard deviations. Now, the final distribution, once you combine all of those, is actually unknown at the outset. So we don't know whether we've got a normal or a log normal type distribution. So therefore, I guess the best mathematical way to combine these would be use some sort of Monte Carlo method. So we're not making assumptions about the final distribution, but we're going to calculate the desired percentiles from the means and standard deviations directly. So that's currently what the online application is that some of you may have heard is also under development. It's actually using the at-risk software to do Monte Carlo simulations of these distributions properly. However, until that's ready to be rolled out, we've updated the manual and we're trying to improve the way that the calculations can be undertaken manually. So when we want to combine the random variables, so if we want to combine, like I said, multiple tasks from different distributions, we're going to use the mean and the variance. The variance being the square of the standard deviation. So random variables can be combined in many ways, but for the purpose of FBIM, it's the accumulation or the sum of these times that are of interest. So we're wanting to add these variables. So to do this, the procedure that's outlined is to add up the individual means to get an overall mean, and then to add the individual variances to get an overall variance. And then the overall standard deviation is the square root of that variance. And so there's a bit of a blurb in the manual there to say why we go into this effort of converting from a standard deviation to a variance back to standard deviation. And the conservative that comes up if you do that is shown by a simple example that if you have two standard deviations of 2 that you're adding, if you simply add the standard deviations, you get an answer of 4. However, if you square the standard deviations, 2 squared plus 2 squared, you'll get 8, and the square root of that is 2.82. So to properly add those standard deviations, we're getting 2.82 instead of 4. So there you can see that we hopefully are resulting in not so overly conservative results. Just again, to further illustrate the point, I'll run through an example. So we've given a table there, suggested way of outlining how we add up the individual times and activities to do this combining of means and standard deviations. So if we look at an example, we're going to add up dismounting the appliance and donning the BA and flushing a hydrant. So if we pull out the various means and standard deviations from the tables here, again, these are the tables from that other document I was referring to. If we look at scenario 1 where we sum the standard deviations, we've got those values in the table, which will add up to using sorry, I forgot to add, we'll use a 90th percentile. So that's 3.17 times standard deviation. Scenario 1, summing up the standard deviations would be simply 120.9 for the sum of the means, plus 3.17 times the sum of the standard deviations, 55.5, resulting in 296.8. However, if we follow through and do the variances and summing the variances and then square rooting back, we get an answer of 249.4. Again, just showing this way of calculation is not so conservative when we're adding up multiple percentiles. Okay, now moving on to the changes to the charts, which would probably be of most interest for people. So there's been minor changes throughout, such as some wording, numbering, etc. There's been revisions to the supporting notes to hopefully provide some more clarification and guidance to people about what is intended by each action and what sorts of things are considered. So some of the tasks and processes have changed in the charts. So there's been a little bit of an update, you know, if there's a better way to represent an activity of fire brigade intervention, we've done that to update it. However, our main approach has been to try and simplify things. Some have resulted in major changes to the approach. For example, the response times, which I'll go through, and I'll go through some of the examples on the following slides. Again, we're not going to go through each chart in great detail, but just to highlight some of the key changes. So as you can see, if we look at chart 2, we've dramatically simplified this one down from 11 tasks down to 5. So we could, as we went back through it, we could see that there was an easier way we could still get the same outcome, not have to ask so many questions. Chart 4 is the time taken to reach the fire scene. Now this is one where we have dramatically changed the result, try and simplify it, but also come up with probably better results given our technology that has improved in this time frame. So in some cases, the fire brigade may have accurate and up-to-date records for appliance travel speeds. At the moment, it's still based on the 97 version, the data that we have. So, you know, we're 20 plus years down the track. You know, are those travel speeds still appropriate with our current traffic and the like? You know, we've got different areas have changed significantly in that time. But I guess what's more important is we have digital mapping software such as Google Maps available to us now, and so we've gone down the approach of allowing or suggesting that would be a better way to come up with our travel time responses. However, I guess in order to achieve the most appropriate time, we need to still try and be conservative. The manual sets out an approach that must be used and documented. And essentially, that approach is looking at doing your Google Maps time at different days of the week and different times of the day, and then giving some guidance about how to come up with a reasonable time based on all those estimates, so that we can look at a generally conservative result without being overly conservative. Chart 10 has been dramatically simplified as well. So again, we're just simplifying the chart process. Again, not going through it in great detail. Chart 12, again, we can see that we've simplified down from 19 down to 11 tasks. Chart 13, again, we've simplified the layout, tried to make it easier to follow. All right, so just to sum up this section, so like I said, we weren't intending to run this as a training session on how to undertake FBIM in full. It was just to give you a bit of an overview of the types of changes that have been made. But I guess it's just want to make clear that we haven't highlighted every single change that's been made. So as we've made many changes throughout different sections, we encourage everyone to review the entire guideline, as well as that associated dataset document. And going forward, I guess it's also important to make sure that when you're undertaking an FBIM model, that you're using the latest charts and data. So from time to time, we'll be updating charts to if a practice or something has changed. But I guess we have an ongoing program to try and include more and more data. So running more exercises with more agencies to try and keep that data up to date. And so we're looking at providing an option where you can register with AFAC to receive updates to the manual and the data. So that concludes my section. And I'll flick over to Ivan to see if he can get John back on board.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll try to get John going.
I'm here.
Welcome back, John. Let me just get your slide up.
It's good to be back, I can tell you. It's good to be anywhere, as Keith Richards would say. All right, folks. Well, again, I apologise for that technical difficulty, but we've left the best to last. So I'll just quickly go through this and we can get through the questions. So basically what I'll be talking about is how FBIM came about and its background, so you'll understand the context. But as I was trying to say earlier, by 1995, work had already begun on the development of performance-based building code of Australia. As many of you know, up until 1996, the building code had been deemed to satisfy prescriptive. There were no performance provisions, and 1996 was going to be an introduction with the building code with the performance provisions included. Building Code of Australia, now known as the National Construction Code. During those discussions and workshops, there was lots of discussion about what role should the role of the fire brigades at a fire be reflected and be included in the performance provisions. And the discussion was with the Building Codes Committee. For those who don't know the role of the Building Codes Committee, they are an advisory group to it's the industry advisory group to the Australian Building Codes Board. They consist of the state and territory building regulators and the peak industry bodies for fire and building around Australia. So they determined that if the fire brigade role was to be reflected in the performance provisions, then the fire brigades would have to provide a measurable and transparent methodology by which their role could be seen and calculated, etc. One could argue it was the first verification method. Thank you, Ivan. Next slide. So the Australian Fire Authorities Council, in taking up that challenge, by the way, there was only 12 months by which this could be done in. They decided to get staff from the existing fire agencies around Australia and New Zealand, with the main function of coming up with this methodology, which was to formulate a quantitative model of fire brigade operations on the fire ground. It's important to note that this was to be a theoretical methodology. It was not to reflect in any way the actual operations of what happens on a fire ground. No two fires are the same, and even a similar fire can be dealt with in many different ways depending on the circumstances at the time. So it's a theoretical model, the same, basically a fire engineering tool, the same way that one would look at a fire growth model or an evacuation model. Thank you, Ivan. So, as I said, there were staff drawn from all around the fire services in Australia and New Zealand, and they were brought together with skills in engineering, applied science, mathematics, building surveying, and business administration. As well as most of those people on the committee were also operational firefighters, and there was 80 years of firefighting experience around that table for the initial team that you can see up there on your screen. Since then, a lot of people have done a lot of work since to update and put new information and make it more contemporary for FBIM, and I particularly want to mention Jamie Vistas, who you heard from before, from Fire Risk in New South Wales, Simon Davis from the New Zealand Fire Service, and a lot of work being done by Ivan West from the AFAC office. Next slide, please, Ivan. So, as I said before, it was, this committee was got together, and the first task they did was really to look around whether something already exists, whether there's already a fire engineering tool or a methodology. So there was an extensive literature review to find out if something already existed, as well as one of the committee was selected to go on an international tour, something which the other members of the committee still haven't forgiven him for, but they need to get over it. But that was for you, Nabs. But so one of the committee went and visited fire authorities, regulatory authorities, and educational institutions overseas, including New Zealand, America, Canada, England, the Netherlands, and Sweden, focusing on particularly fire brigades that already operated in a performance-based building code environment, or where a performance-based building code was already touted to be introduced, to see what methodologies they had or how they dealt with their role in these things, as well as not only performance-based building code, but fire engineering and fire engineering analysis. In short, there was nothing found. There was lots of very good data, lots of very interesting operational procedures, but there was no methodology or fire engineering tool that determined a fire brigade intervention and was suitable for Australia. So the committee then had to set about from scratch, coming up with its own methodology. Thank you, Ivan. So, as I said before, this was developed with the intention only of its use as for the performance provisions for the design stage of the building development for the Building Code of Australia, now known as National Construction Code. And I'll stress again, it's not to be used or seen as what actually happens on a fire ground at a real fire. It could be used outside the BCA performance provisions, but and that would have to be in conjunction with the appropriate fire brigade, but its intention was for the Building Code or the National Construction Code. So the first task was to develop flow charts covering all the tasks that a fire service will do in relation to a fire, starting from the fire initiation to the fire brigade being contacted, travelling to the fire scene, setting up, undertaking assessment and investigation, and so on. So the flow charts were developed, and with them had to come an extensive range of data, which would go to them, which would supplement those tasks on the flow charts, and that came from data that already existed, as well as some of the fire authorities around Australia and New Zealand undertook tasks which we gained data and timings from. And I said earlier that there were operational firefighters around that on that committee, which with 80 years of experience, and their experience and input also came was part of the data used. So this became the fire brigade intervention model. So 12 months on, a presentation was made to the same Building Codes Committee in a meeting up in Sydney on this methodology that AFAC had developed. There was a lot of robust discussion and questions, and in the end, the Building Codes Committee agreed that it was a suitable methodology, and therefore the role of the fire services would be included into the performance provisions of the Building Code of Australia. Next slide, Ivan. So why the fire services role in the performance provisions? Well, it stands to reason that at any fire, the fire brigade will turn up, and their operational procedures and their input in the fire will have an impact on the fire growth, fire spread, and also the interaction with the fire protection systems within the building as well. So at any fire, the fire brigade will turn up, and even if the analysis, the theoretical analysis shows that that because the performance of an installed system as say a sprinkler system may well control or extinguish the fire, community expectation, current practice, but also the role defined under the different fire brigade acts around Australia and New Zealand dictate their mandatory attendance. Even if it's only to reset the fire indicator panel or to put the sprinkler system back into operation or look for any spread of fire or to even control, to extinguish that controlled fire that's been controlled by the sprinkler system. Someone's still got to put it out. So at every fire, the fire brigade will turn up. So when undertaking any performance provision that involves the fire brigade turning up, then an FBIM would need to be undertaken. Now, there are numerous fire brigades around Australia, and they're broken up into regional, inner suburban, urban, or even rural fire brigades. But the operations of fire brigades at fires are pretty much consistent around Australia, but there are variances, such as the equipment they have, the topography, whether they're volunteer or permanent, and so on. So when undertaking an FBIM analysis, it's important that you must consult with the appropriate fire brigade so that the data and understanding of those variances are reflected in any analysis. So that was my bit. Again, I apologise for the mess up at the start. Hope you found it worthwhile. So now I hand over to Ivan for any questions you may have.
Thanks, John. We've got one question here ready to go. If you've got some questions, quickly type them into the question and answer panel. I've answered a couple as we've moved along, but maybe Jamie, this is one for you. It's a fairly general question. Are all charts cumulative, i.e. we need to add the time for each chart to have the total FBIM?
All right. I guess the simple answer is yes. However, I guess it depends on what purpose the model is being run, and I guess it's not just a matter of just adding up one of each table. Sometimes you do need to do multiples for each table, depending on how many appliances have been dispatched as part of the particular simulation that you're doing. So I guess the other thing is looking at what time you're looking at. So, you know, are you looking at the time to apply water? Are you looking at the time up until end of search and rescue? And so depends on, I guess, what particular part of FBIM you're looking at for the aspect of the performance solution that you're doing, or whatever other application it is. So like I said, simple answer is yes, but there might be multiple kind of routes you need to go down. You might need to do the same chart multiple times.
Thanks, Jamie. Another one, is there any plan to obtain more data? Some data have very small sample size with significant standard deviations. Yep.
So answer is yes. Exercises have already been written and practiced. The next step is just to try and roll that out through as many agencies as we can to get many crews to run through them. So again, that was, like we said, one of the reasons why we separated that data out from the main part of the manual, so that can be easily updated without having to revise the whole manual. I don't have any indication of timeframes for that at the moment, Ivan. I don't know if you can answer that either, but
no specific timeframes, but it's definitely on the work plan for our fire engineering network. Okay, thank you. Another one, I noticed this FBIM excludes scope for tunnels. How about train bus stations? I guess, Jamie, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, yep. So I guess, yes, it has been excluded in terms of, in the sense that it's been developed for your typical building under the NCC. My view would be you could still apply it to get an estimate for tunnels. You just would have to potentially modify some of the flow charts. You might need to add a few activities that may not be in there. And so for that reason, I guess I wouldn't say don't use it at all, because there is nothing else to give you guidance. But you would need to make modifications, and again, that will be best done through FBIM consultation with the relevant fire service. So I think that would apply to tunnels, your railway stations, any of that sort of infrastructure.
Absolutely. I think the long-term plan is that we can include those in the scope, but because we haven't done the proper analysis up till now, we don't want to, I guess, put across the wrong, make people feel like we're all happy with it being used for those things. It would also need significant consultation with your fire brigade.
Yeah, I don't know if John's got any further background to add from the. No.
Okay, next one. A couple of the questions are around the online version, as we mentioned before. This webinar is particularly focused on the changes to the guideline, the manual itself. If you scroll up the question and answer panel, there's a link to where you can, let me just double check. If you're interested in receiving updates, including possible opportunities for early access to beta versions, please visit. There's a MailChimp link there. If you add your email to that, we'll provide some updates as they become available on the computerized version. Next question. So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes. So next question: how long does it take? How long does it typically take a fire safety engineer to undertake an FBIM for a typical shopping centre or high-rise building?
All right. So assuming that, I guess the ideal process would be the fire engineer goes through and has a bit of a go, identifies there are a heap of questions that you'd need to consult the fire service with to make, what are the tactics, strategies that might be actually undertaken for this particular scenario with this building and the particular stations that are responding. So there will be pardon me, a bit of toing and froing associated with that. Off the top of my head, if you just sat down with knowing those inputs, I'm just going to have a quick look at what the examples were. High rise or shopping centre, was it? Yeah, say a typical high rise, I would guess maybe an hour or two if you kind of knew what you were doing. If you're familiar with it and you were just ticking through the various flow charts with the known inputs, I would say an hour or two.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. John, this was one for you. Other than being referenced in the fire safety verification method in NCC 2019, is there a requirement for FERs to utilise the new FBIM method? I should note that it's not a new FBIM method. We've just updated what's been around for 20 years.
Well, as I said in the presentation, if you're to comply with the performance provisions of the Building Code of Australia, or I should say, I'm showing my age, the National Construction Code, then you would have to address the role of the fire service. Now, whether you think it's significant or not is entirely part of the assessment. But if you are to comply with the performance provisions of the National Construction Code, and that performance provision reflects on the role of the fire service, then yes, you'd have to underdo an FBIM.
Okay, thanks, John. Jamie, for you, are certain charts expected to run at the same time? If so, how is this considered to be cumulative?
Yeah, so yeah, I've just read that one too, and that's a good point. Probably I should have added that to the response on the previous one about them being cumulative, which I guess thinking back, I can see probably where the questions come about. Yeah, there are certain tasks that are undertaken in parallel with each other. And so in which case you need to define the critical path, and they're the times that you would add up. So there's a bit of description in the manual, but it's just like a simple kind of Gantt chart is normally how it's presented to determine the critical path. And so, yeah, you are not summing every task on every chart in a cumulative way. It's just the ones along the critical path. So that, yeah, that was a good pickup by the person asking that question.
I've got a question. Any recommended method to calculate the detection time?
We haven't put anything in the FBIM. I think we put a note in the explanatory charts to say that that should be undertaken using typical fire engineering methodologies. So, you know, IFEG and many others produce that. So FBIM itself does not dictate or suggest a specific methodology. We've just referred to general fire engineering methodologies.
Okay, and this one that's just popped up. Will the fire brigades be available in a reasonable time frame for fire safety engineers for the suggested meeting with the fire brigades to discuss input? Will this be lumped with FEBs, or can meetings be arranged quicker? This is probably a little bit of a minefield.
Yeah, I guess it's not something we can answer on behalf of every fire brigade.
No, that's right. Every fire service is different.
And depends on what's considered a reasonable time frame. So from our fire and SW's perspective, I guess I can say that, you know, from an FEB point of view, we've got I think the latest is sort of a 3 to 6 week kind of turnaround for a full FEBQ. My assumption would be most of these would be falling into the categories of the FEB, so it could be incorporated as part of that. I don't know if there'd be many projects outside that people would consult on us. Sorry, I don't think there'll be many additional projects outside of what we're currently consulting on where this would be applicable. So expectation will be it's generally part of the FEB. And if not, from our perspective, if you're wanting input, it'd still be that same process anyway. But I don't know if John wants to add something from an AFAT perspective on this consultation.
Well, I think the best advice is to contact your appropriate fire service that that will be helping you with the assessment. I mean, it also varies to what the legislation is as well. But I'm afraid I'm not in a position the same as Jamie to actually speak on behalf of every fire service around Australia.
Yeah, thanks. I think that one was a bit of a grenade.
Just a slight one, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's not that it's unimportant, but it was a bit of a grenade. Last question before we sign off. FBIM is dependent on operational requirements which are not defined and vary from brigade to brigade and potentially shift to shift. Hopefully not so much shift to shift, but how can we gain an understanding of these?
So again, I would say that just highlights the importance of following the FEB process and consulting with the fire brigade throughout. I don't think there's any way a fire engineer would know how every fire service operates in detail. So you're going to have to rely on that. But I guess hopefully through the manual, there's a little bit of information there. And then, like we're saying, through subsequent webinars and examples, we can hopefully flesh that out a little bit more. But I don't think we'll ever be able to publish anything that gives that level of detail for every fire service. You know, it needs to be constantly updated because equipment appliances are updated regularly too. So John, do you want to add to that as well?
No, I think that's fine, Jamie. I think you summed it up pretty well. Yeah, you're on. I think you're on mute, Ivan.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, John. And thanks everybody for attending today. Hope that was a little bit of insight into some of the changes that you'll be able to incorporate as you work on your FBIMs. If you have any questions, feel free to contact AFAC and we'll try to do what we can to answer those. So thank you for your time and we'll see you next time. Thanks.